It was a perfect summer afternoon in Columbus, Ohio, when 7-year-old Sarah Mitchell decided to play in her backyard. The sun was at its peak, casting minimal shadows across the lush green lawn that her father had meticulously maintained all spring. Sarah's mother, Jennifer, had just set up a small picnic table on the patio with freshly squeezed lemonade and homemade cookies, treats meant to reward Sarah for completing her summer reading assignment ahead of schedule. The sky was an impossibly clear blue, with only wispy clouds drifting lazily overhead. There was that perfect kind of warmth that made children want to stay outside forever, the kind of day that gets remembered in photographs as the definition of childhood innocence. Sarah, dressed in her favorite pink sundress with white sandals, had been chasing butterflies around the garden for nearly an hour. She had a small butterfly net, a birthday present from her grandmother, and she wielded it with the seriousness of a scientist conducting groundbreaking research. She'd managed to catch 3 different butterfly species, carefully observing them in a clear jar before releasing them unharmed. Her laugh echoed through the neighborhood, a sound of pure, unfiltered joy. Her parents had been watching from the patio, smiling at each other with that silent understanding that only parents know. The appreciation of moments like these that pass too quickly, the recognition that their daughter was growing up, becoming more independent, more curious about the world around her. The Mitchell house sat on a quiet residential street in a family-friendly neighborhood. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names, where kids played safely, and where the most significant concern was usually who would win the annual 4th of July pie contest at the community center. Michael Mitchell, Sarah's father, was a high school history teacher known for his patience and dedication. Jennifer worked as a pediatric nurse at the local hospital, a job that had given her an almost sixth sense about children's safety. They had chosen this neighborhood specifically because it felt secure, stable, and perfect for raising their daughter. But perfection, as it often does, was about to shatter. The fence separating the Mitchells' property from the neighboring yard had been in place for 12 years. It was a standard 6-foot wooden fence, painted a cheerful white that Jennifer refreshed every 2 years. The neighbors on the other side, an older couple named the Hendersons, had recently agreed to board a police K-9 unit named Duke, while Officer James underwent family crisis management at his brother's house 2 states away. Duke was supposed to stay only 4 weeks. Officer had assured the Hendersons that Duke was exceptionally well-trained, socialized, and posed no risk to anyone. The Hendersons, who owned no children and had limited interaction with their neighbors, had agreed without fully understanding the implications. The police department arranged to set up a secure enclosure in the Hendersons' backyard, a chain-link structure that was supposed to be both comfortable for the dog and completely secure for the surrounding community. That enclosure, however, had a problem that nobody noticed until it was far too late. The latch on the gate of Duke's enclosure had been installed incorrectly 6 months ago by a junior officer tasked with routine maintenance. The bolt didn't align properly with the frame, creating a gap of nearly half an inch. Over months, through the dog's constant movements, pushing and pulling against the fence during daily exercises, the gap had widened imperceptibly. The thing about enclosure failure is that it rarely happens all at once. It's usually a gradual process, a series of small oversights and missed opportunities to catch the problem. Officer had been informed twice by his supervisor that the latch seemed loose. Both times, he'd acknowledged the concern but never actually addressed it. After all, Duke had never escaped before. After all, it was just a temporary arrangement. After all, what could really go wrong? At 3:47 p.m. on that perfect summer afternoon, Duke pushed against the gate with his full muscular weight, as he did dozens of times every day. But this time the gate swung open. The 85-pound German Shepherd, bred and trained for aggression and pursuit, suddenly found himself free. His instincts took over immediately. A police K-9 isn't just a dog, it's a weapon. Duke had been trained to chase, to apprehend, and to bite on command. In that moment, with no handler present, no commands being given, only his base instincts remained. Sarah was still chasing butterflies, her back to the fence, completely unaware of the danger. She heard the sound of splintering wood as Duke crashed through the weaker sections of the aging fence, but she didn't immediately understand what it meant. By the time her 7-year-old brain processed the noise and she turned around, Duke was already charging across the Mitchell lawn, his massive frame covering ground with terrifying speed. Sarah screamed. It wasn't a scream of excitement or play. It was a primal sound of pure terror that any parent would recognize instantly as a sign of mortal danger. She dropped her butterfly net and ran toward the house, her small legs pumping frantically. Her mother heard that scream from the patio and knew something was catastrophically wrong. Jennifer's nurse training kicked in as she saw the massive dog bearing down on her daughter, but she was too far away to reach Sarah before Duke did. Duke leaped, his jaws open. Sarah tried to dodge, but she was far too small to outmaneuver a trained attack dog. His teeth found her left leg first, tearing through skin and muscle with brutal efficiency. She fell to the ground and the dog continued his assault, now biting at her arm as she tried desperately to shield her face. The terror was absolute, an adult-level comprehension of mortality in a 7-year-old body. Jennifer screamed her daughter's name with a mother's anguish that would haunt Michael for years to come. She ran toward the dog, grabbing a lawn chair and swinging it with all her strength, trying to force Duke to release her daughter. The pain and panic forced Sarah to scream louder, a sound that neighbors would later describe as the most horrible thing they'd ever heard. Other neighbors appeared on their patios, shocked into momentary paralysis before some started calling 911, shouting that a police dog was attacking a child. Within minutes, an emergency response unit arrived, sirens wailing. Officer, the dog's handler, wasn't home to control Duke. Instead, it took police officers themselves to finally subdue the dog and get Sarah the medical attention she desperately needed. She was bleeding heavily, in shock, and traumatized beyond measure. As her mother held her in the ambulance, applying pressure to the wounds, she whispered reassurances that she herself didn't believe. Sarah's innocence had been shattered in under 60 seconds. That perfect summer afternoon in Columbus, Ohio would be remembered as the last day of Sarah Mitchell's childhood. The emergency room at Columbus Children's Hospital was a blur of controlled chaos. Sarah lay on a gurney, her small body surrounded by medical professionals who moved with practiced efficiency around her trauma. The initial assessment was terrifying for Michael and Jennifer. Their daughter's left leg had 3 deep puncture wounds that had narrowly missed the femoral artery. If Duke's teeth had penetrated just 1 inch to the right, Sarah would have bled out within minutes. Her right arm bore 4 more lacerations, evidence of her desperate attempts to shield her face from the attacking dog. The attending physician, Dr. Robert Martinez, had seen animal attacks before, but the ferocity of this one was remarkable. He immediately ordered imaging to check for deeper tissue damage and infection risk. As the medical team prepared Sarah for the suturing process, Michael and Jennifer were asked to wait in the family waiting room, a sterile, uncomfortable space with outdated magazines and a coffee machine that smelled like burnt despair. They sat in silence, neither able to speak. Jennifer kept replaying those final moments before the attack, analyzing every detail, wondering if she could have done something differently. Should she have been standing closer? Should she have been watching more carefully? The guilt was suffocating. Michael, meanwhile, was experiencing something different. A burning rage directed at the police department, at officer, at the system that had allowed a dangerous animal to be housed in their quiet residential neighborhood. His hands clenched and unclenched repeatedly, his jaw working silently as he tried to maintain composure. A social worker named Maria approached them with gentle professionalism. She delivered bad news to families countless times, but this case hit differently. A 7-year-old attacked in her own backyard by a police dog. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Maria explained the extent of Sarah's injuries, the surgical plan, and the fact that Sarah would need to be admitted for overnight observation due to the depth of the wounds and infection risk. She also carefully mentioned that they should prepare themselves for the possibility of post-traumatic stress disorder. Children often develop anxiety after traumatic events like this, Maria explained softly. The good news is that Sarah is physically going to recover fully. The long-term psychological impact will depend on several factors, including family support and how the situation is handled moving forward. Michael finally spoke, his voice hoarse from stress. We need to know about the dog. Was it properly trained? Was the enclosure secure? How did this even happen? Maria explained that she didn't have those details, but that the police department would likely be sending someone to speak with them soon. The words felt hollow, bureaucratic platitudes when what they wanted was accountability and assurance that this would never happen to another child. The surgery lasted nearly 2 hours. 32 stitches would be placed, a number that would haunt Sarah's nightmares for years to come. The doctor explained that with proper wound care, the physical scarring would fade significantly over time, though some permanent marks would likely remain as lifelong reminders of the attack. When Sarah was finally wheeled into a private recovery room, sedated and heavily bandaged, her parents barely recognized her. Their vibrant, laughing daughter looked fragile and small, her innocence seemingly drained away in those violent seconds. That evening, as Sarah slept restlessly under the influence of pain medication, Officer James arrived at the hospital with the police department's public relations officer, Captain David. They approached Michael and Jennifer with expressions of contrived sympathy that felt rehearsed and empty. Attempted to explain that Duke was an exceptionally well-trained K-9 unit, that the escape was unprecedented, and that it was simply a tragic accident. He downplayed the severity of the incident and began, almost immediately, to construct a narrative that placed some responsibility on Sarah herself. Sometimes children can startle dogs, said, his tone suggesting he was imparting wisdom rather than making excuses. If she was running or suddenly appearing, it can trigger a chase response. K-9 units are trained for protection, and sometimes. Michael stood abruptly, his fists trembling. My daughter was playing in her own backyard. Your dog attacked her. There is no narrative here where that's acceptable. Captain intervened smoothly, attempting damage control. He assured the Mitchells that the police department took this very seriously and that they would be conducting a full investigation. He also mentioned, carefully, almost casually, that the department had liability insurance and that they should contact their own insurance company about coverage. The implication was clear. They were already thinking about legal liability, about minimizing the department's exposure. It was a moment that shifted something fundamental in Michael's perspective. This wasn't about concern for their daughter or genuine accountability. This was about protecting an institution. Over the next week, as Sarah remained hospitalized, strange things began happening. First, their homeowner's insurance company called to clarify their coverage, already discussing liability limitations. Then a police department attorney reached out with what he described as helpful information about how animal attacks typically fall outside police liability in most jurisdictions. The implication was clear. Don't bother suing, you'll lose. But Michael wasn't deterred. He began making phone calls, asking questions, requesting information about similar incidents. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Through persistent inquiry and public records requests, Michael learned that Duke had been involved in at least 2 other incidents in the previous 2 years. In both cases, the families had accepted settlements and signed non-disclosure agreements, legal documents that prevented them from discussing the attacks publicly. The amounts of those settlements, buried in police department budget reports, suggested that the department knew Duke was dangerous. They knew, and they did nothing to stop it. They simply paid off the families and moved on, treating the problem as a financial matter rather than a safety issue. When Michael shared this discovery with Jennifer, who was alternating between the hospital and their home to care for their other responsibilities, something hardened in both of them. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a one-time failure. This was negligence enabled by an institution that was more interested in protecting itself than protecting the community. The police department had repeatedly ignored warning signs, failed to maintain equipment properly, and knowingly placed a dangerous animal in a residential neighborhood. Sarah's physical recovery was progressing well, but her psychological state was deteriorating. She was having nightmares where she relived the attack in vivid detail. Loud noises, a car backfiring, a door slamming sent her into panic attacks. She refused to go outside, even into their backyard. When other children played nearby, she would become anxious and clingy. The vibrant, adventurous 7-year-old they had known was being replaced by a fearful, traumatized child who flinched at shadows. On Sarah's last night in the hospital, as Michael sat beside her sleeping form, he made a decision. He wouldn't let this be swept under the rug. He wouldn't allow the police department to pay a settlement and silence their daughter's experience. He would fight back, no matter the cost. He pulled out his phone and began searching for attorneys who specialized in personal injury and institutional negligence cases. His daughter deserved justice, and he would make sure the world knew what had really happened. The next morning, Michael called an attorney named David, a man with a reputation for taking on powerful institutions and winning. The journey toward accountability had begun, one phone call at a time, driven by a father's love and determination to protect not just his daughter, but every other child in their community who could become Duke's next victim. David's office was located on the 15th floor of a downtown Columbus law building, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. When Michael and Jennifer first met with him, they were immediately struck by his intensity and focus. Was in his mid-50s, with silver threading through his dark hair, and he possessed the kind of calm confidence that came from years of taking on powerful institutions and winning. He listened to their story without interrupting, taking meticulous notes, occasionally nodding or frowning as details emerged. When they finished, he leaned back in his leather chair and spoke with calculated certainty. "This isn't just about negligence," said, his eyes sharp and analytical. "This is about systemic failure, institutional indifference, and deliberate concealment. The fact that there are previous incidents tells me something critical. They knew. The police department knew Duke was a liability, and they chose to ignore it. That transforms this from an accident into a liability case with real teeth." Immediately began assembling a team. He hired an investigator named, a former police officer turned private investigator who knew the Columbus Police Department intimately and understood how to navigate their bureaucratic systems. He also brought in Dr. Edmonds, a veterinary psychologist who specialized in K-9 behavioral assessment. His plan was comprehensive and aggressive. They would obtain every record related to Duke, Officer, the K-9 program, and the previous incidents. The first major hurdle was accessing information the police department didn't want to release. The 2 previous attack settlements had been buried under non-disclosure agreements, but knew that public institutions couldn't use such agreements to conceal systemic failures or patterns of negligence. He filed formal public records requests, citing Ohio's public records law and arguing that information about public safety failures was information the taxpayers had a right to access. The police department's attorneys immediately began fighting the requests, claiming attorney-client privilege and confidentiality protections, but was patient and methodical. He filed motion after motion, each one slightly different, each one attacking from a different legal angle. Meanwhile, was conducting his own investigation. He interviewed neighbors who had witnessed the attack and discovered that several had seen Duke escape his enclosure on at least 4 previous occasions. They had called the Hendersons to report the loose dog, but nothing had been done. One elderly neighbor named Ruth Carmichael, who had lived on the street for 30 years, became particularly helpful. She had kept detailed notes of every time she'd seen Duke loose, with dates and times. She produced a small notebook filled with entries like June 15th large dog loose in street at 3:30 p.m., chased neighbor's cat. Her documentation was meticulous and damning. Dr. Edmonds reviewed Duke's training records and behavioral assessments, which finally obtained through a combination of public records requests and subpoenas. What she found was shocking. 6 months before Sarah's attack, Duke's behavioral assessment had flagged concerning aggression markers. A veterinary psychologist named Dr. Berkshire, who had conducted the assessment, had written detailed notes expressing concern about Duke's prey drive and recommending enhanced supervision protocols and restricted access to situations that might trigger predatory responses. The assessment was dated January 2019, yet no enhanced protocols had been implemented. Officer had received the report but apparently filed it away and continued standard procedures. The enclosure maintenance records were equally damning. The engineering specifications showed that the latch had been installed incorrectly. A junior officer named Thomas had performed the installation and, according to maintenance logs, had flagged the misalignment in a work order. That work order sat in a filing system for 6 months, never escalated, never addressed. When was later interviewed by, he became emotional recounting how he'd tried to get someone to fix it. "I wrote it up," said, his frustration evident even years later. "I told my supervisor, I left notes. Nobody cared. If they just fixed that latch in the first place, none of this would have happened." His team also obtained officer's personnel file, which revealed a troubling pattern. Had received 2 separate warnings from his supervisor, Lieutenant Sarah, about the loose enclosure latch. Notes were specific and documented. Officer advised regarding faulty gate latch on K9 enclosure. Officer acknowledged understanding, but has not submitted work request for repairs. Advised this poses potential safety risk. Both warnings were dated months before Sarah's attack. As the evidence accumulated, local news outlets caught wind of the investigation. A reporter from the Columbus Dispatch named Jennifer Park, who specialized in institutional accountability stories, began reaching out to his office. Was initially cautious. Litigation often benefited from low media profiles, but he recognized that public pressure could be a powerful tool. He gave Park access to carefully selected documents and allowed her to interview Michael Mitchell about the attack and its aftermath. The resulting article, published on a Sunday morning, exploded across the local news landscape. "Police dog with history of violence attacks 7-year-old girl. Department allegedly covered up previous incidents," the headline read. The article detailed the attack, Sarah's ongoing trauma, and the discovery of the 2 previous incidents that had been settled quietly. It quoted unnamed sources close to the investigation and included Dr. Edmonds' professional analysis that Duke showed signs of predatory aggression. The piece was meticulously researched and devastatingly thorough. The police department's response was immediate and defensive. They held a press conference where Captain insisted that Duke was a well-trained, dedicated officer with an exemplary service record. He characterized the investigation as politically motivated and suggested that the media was sensationalizing an unfortunate accident. But the narrative was slipping away from them. That afternoon, the Columbus City Council received multiple calls from residents demanding answers. Councilwoman Torres, who had been skeptical of police department claims, requested a formal briefing on the K9 program and safety protocols. Sarah's image began appearing in news coverage, and while he'd been careful not to exploit his client, the photographs of her scars and bandages told a story that words couldn't match. A picture of 7-year-old Sarah, her small arm wrapped in white gauze, sitting on her mother's lap looking frightened and vulnerable, became iconic. It ran with nearly every story about the case, a visual representation of institutional failure and negligence. Within 2 weeks, his team had accumulated over 500 pages of documentation proving systemic failure. The pattern was undeniable: warnings ignored, maintenance requests filed away, behavioral concerns dismissed, previous incidents concealed. What had begun as a simple animal attack was transforming into a scandal of institutional negligence. The police department, sensing the tide turning against them, began reaching out to explore settlement negotiations, but wasn't interested in quiet settlements or non-disclosure agreements. This case was about accountability and change, and he was prepared to take it all the way to trial if necessary. As fall approached and the legal machinery began its slow, grinding motion toward confrontation, Sarah continued therapy sessions with a trauma specialist named Dr. Helen. Sarah was slowly, incrementally beginning to heal, but the emotional scars remained deep. She still had nightmares. She still avoided the backyard. But she was beginning to understand in age-appropriate ways that her experience mattered, that people were fighting for her, and that sometimes speaking truth required courage. The trial date was set for October 15th, exactly 14 months after Sarah's attack. The intervening year had been a cascade of legal filings, depositions, discovery disputes, and settlement negotiations that ultimately went nowhere. The police department remained adamant in their position. Duke was a properly trained K-9 unit. The enclosure failure was an isolated mechanical issue, and while they sympathized with Sarah's injuries, they bore no responsibility for the actions of the dog. Their insurance company had calculated the risk and decided that fighting the case in court was cheaper than settling. This calculation would prove to be catastrophically wrong. In the weeks leading up to trial, David's office became a war room of preparation. Large whiteboards covered with timelines, photographs, and key evidence lined the walls. Had assembled his complete team, 2 junior attorneys named Michael Torres and who specialized in evidence presentation, a trial consultant named Doctor who specialized in jury psychology, and his original investigative team. They spent hours analyzing depositions, refining arguments, and preparing for every conceivable scenario the defense might present. One evening, as the legal team worked late into the night reviewing Duke's training videos, called Sarah and her parents into his office. It was an unusual move. He typically kept his young clients distant from the intense legal preparation, but he believed Sarah needed to understand what was coming. She was 9 years old now, nearly 2 years older than when the attack occurred, and while she had made progress in her recovery, the approaching trial was causing new anxiety to emerge. Sarah sat between her parents, her small frame looking even smaller in the oversized conference chair, knelt down slightly to meet her at eye level, his voice gentle but serious. "Sarah, I want to prepare you for what's going to happen in court. You're going to see Duke again. I know that's scary. You're going to see the man who was taking care of him. And there are going to be a lot of people in the room, the judge, the jury, lawyers, reporters, and people who want to support you." Sarah's eyes widened with anxiety. "Do I have to see the dog?" "Yes," said honestly, "but Duke will be secured. He won't be able to hurt you, and we're going to be right there with you. More importantly, your job is simple. You just have to tell the truth about what happened. You don't have to remember everything perfectly. You don't have to be brave or strong. You just have to be honest about what you experienced." Over the following weeks, Sarah worked with a child psychologist specializing in trial preparation named Dr. Foster. Foster used age-appropriate techniques to help Sarah process what she would experience in court. They role-played courtroom scenarios, visited the empty courthouse on weekends to familiarize Sarah with the physical space, and practiced grounding techniques for managing anxiety. Foster was particularly concerned about Sarah being re-traumatized by the experience. "The courtroom can be triggering," Foster explained to Michael and Jennifer. "Seeing the dog, hearing descriptions of the attack, being questioned by opposing counsel, all of these things could activate her PTSD symptoms. What we're doing is essentially preparing her psychologically for a controlled re-exposure to the trauma. It's not ideal, but given the stakes of the case, we're doing everything we can to help her manage it." Michael and Jennifer prepared their own testimony meticulously, had them detail every doctor's visit, every sleepless night, every moment their daughter had sobbed in fear, every behavioral change they'd witnessed. Jennifer's testimony would focus on the immediate medical response and the long-term physical and emotional consequences. Michael's would emphasize the institutional failure and negligence. Together, they represented the human cost of the police department's negligence. The night before trial, the Mitchell family had dinner together at their favorite restaurant. Sarah picked at her food, her anxiety evident in every movement. She was quiet, withdrawn, her mind clearly elsewhere. Michael reached across the table and took her hand. "Tomorrow is going to be hard," he told her. "But you're the strongest person I know, and whatever happens, we're proud of you. We're going to be right there." Jennifer added, "And remember what Dr. Foster taught you. If you need a break, you can ask for one. If you feel scared, just look for us in the room and remember that we love you no matter what." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, running through everything Dr. Foster had taught her. She thought about the attack, about the pain, about the fear. But she also thought about something else, a sense of purpose that a 9-year-old shouldn't have to feel, but did. She understood in ways beyond her years that what happened to her mattered, that telling her story might protect other children, that courage sometimes meant doing difficult things even when you were scared. Michael also couldn't sleep. He got up at 2:47 a.m. and went to his home office, where he reread the investigation documents one more time, the behavioral assessment, the maintenance records, the warnings officer had ignored, the previous incidents. The evidence was overwhelming, but he knew from explanations that evidence alone sometimes wasn't enough. Judges and juries were human. They could rationalize, minimize, or excuse institutional failures if it was psychologically easier than acknowledging them. He prayed that wouldn't happen here. Jennifer spent her sleepless night reviewing Sarah's medical records, the surgical reports, the photographs of the wounds, the discharge papers from the hospital. She allowed herself to relive those terrifying moments in the emergency room, the helplessness of watching her daughter suffer, the fear that she might lose her. Channeling that fear into determination, she made a mental note. No matter what the defense argued, no matter what excuses they offered, the truth was simple and undeniable. Their daughter had been attacked by a dangerous dog that the police department knew was dangerous and had chosen not to secure properly. At 6:00 a.m., the alarm went off. The day had arrived. Sarah woke with a start, her heart racing. Her mother was already awake, sitting at the edge of the bed. Jennifer pulled her daughter into an embrace and held her, neither of them speaking, both of them drawing strength from each other's presence. By 8:30 a.m., the Mitchell family was in David's office, dressed formally in the clothes they'd chosen carefully. Sarah in a modest but tasteful blue dress, her parents in business attire that conveyed seriousness without arrogance. Reviewed his final instructions, reminding them to speak clearly, to answer only the questions asked, and to remember that everything they said might be reported to the media. As they made their way down to the courthouse parking garage, Sarah took her father's hand. "Dad, what if I mess up? What if I forget things?" Michael squeezed her hand gently. "Then you tell the truth about what you do remember. That's all anyone can ask." At 9:15 a.m., they walked through the courthouse doors. Reporters immediately swarmed, calling questions, cameras flashing. His team quickly shuttled the family through the throng and into the courtroom. Sarah took her seat in the front row, her parents on either side of her. She looked around the room, at the judge's bench, at the jury box where 12 strangers would soon sit, at the table where the police department's attorneys sat reviewing documents, and at the defendant's table where Officer sat, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform. And then in the back corner of the courtroom, she saw Duke. The massive German shepherd sat in his ceremonial vest, a stark reminder of why they were all here. Sarah's breathing became shallow, and she gripped her mother's hand tightly. Jennifer squeezed back reassuringly. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Robert, a 58-year-old jurist known for his fairness and attention to detail, entered and took his seat. He looked out at the courtroom with the kind of measured authority that came from 20 years on the bench. "We are here in the matter of Mitchell versus Columbus Police Department," Judge announced, his voice deep and formal. "This is a civil lawsuit regarding an alleged attack by a K-9 unit that resulted in injuries to a minor. Counsel, are you ready to proceed?" The trial was about to begin. In a few moments, the jury would be seated. The evidence would be presented. The truth would be tested against institutional power. And somewhere in that process, a 9-year-old girl would have to find the courage to point at her attacker and speak her truth to the world. Sarah took a deep breath and waited for her moment. The jury selection process took 2 full days. David was methodical and surgical in his questioning of potential jurors, looking for people who valued accountability and weren't predisposed to protect law enforcement institutions. The police department's attorneys, led by a sharp but ultimately predictable corporate defense lawyer named Richard, sought jurors who were sympathetic to the challenges of police work and inclined toward acceptance of official narratives. By the end of jury selection, 12 jurors and 3 alternates had been chosen, a mix of ages, professions, and backgrounds that believed would be sympathetic to Sarah's case. Opening statements began on the morning of October 16th, stood before the jury with the kind of measured intensity that came from believing deeply in a case. He laid out the narrative clearly: negligence, concealment, and institutional indifference. He showed photographs of the broken enclosure latch, the maintenance records, the behavioral assessment that warned of Duke's aggression. He spoke about warnings ignored and previous victims silenced. And then he told them about Sarah, a 7-year-old girl whose life had been forever altered because powerful institutions had chosen convenience over safety. "What you will see in this courtroom," told the jury, his voice carrying genuine emotion, "is a pattern of failure at every level. The question isn't whether Sarah was attacked. The question is whether the Columbus Police Department knew or should have known that Duke was dangerous, and whether they bear responsibility for failing to prevent this tragedy." His opening was defensive and technical. He emphasized that K-9 units were trained professionals, that mechanical failures could happen to anyone, that the enclosure breach was unpredictable, and that the police department bore no responsibility for an animal's actions in the absence of direct negligence. He painted Officer as a dedicated professional who had done everything required of him. It was a well-constructed argument, but it felt hollow against the weight of narrative. The trial's first week was devoted to establishing the facts: expert witnesses about the enclosure installation, the maintenance records, and the engineering failure. A structural engineer named Dr. Michael detailed exactly how the latch could have been identified and fixed with minimal effort and expense. He was unequivocal in his assessment. This was not a complex problem. The misalignment was obvious to anyone who inspected it carefully. The repair would have taken approximately 20 minutes. Medical experts about Sarah's injuries. Dr. Robert Martinez, the emergency room physician who had treated her, described the severity of the wounds with clinical precision while showing photographs that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. He explained the infection risks, the permanent scarring, and the fact that Sarah had been millimeters away from life-threatening arterial damage. Then came the behavioral expert testimony. Dr. Edmonds, the veterinary psychologist had retained, was articulate and compelling. She walked through Duke's training records, his behavioral assessments, and his history of incidents. When cross-examined her, attempting to paint her as biased, she remained calm and professional. "Dr. Edmonds, isn't it true that K-9 units are trained to have certain aggressive drives?" asked, his tone suggesting this was obvious and therefore not negligent. "Yes," Edmonds agreed. "But there's a critical difference between controlled aggression and uncontrolled aggression. A police dog trained for apprehension can be an effective tool if it's properly managed, supervised, and contained. What we have here is a dog with documented behavioral concerns being housed in an inadequately maintained facility with a handler who ignored multiple warnings about the facility's security. That's not just accepting a dog's nature, that's creating conditions for failure." By midweek, the jury had been presented with overwhelming evidence of institutional negligence, even seemed to sense that his defensive strategy was failing. On Wednesday morning, he made an unusual move. He requested a private meeting with Judge and in the judge's chambers. When everyone reconvened, Judge announced that the parties would take a brief recess while settlement discussions were attempted. This was the moment David had anticipated but actually hoped would occur. He huddled with Michael and Jennifer in a conference room adjacent to the courthouse, laid out his thinking. They're weakening. The evidence is overwhelming. If they're willing to settle now, we need to consider it seriously. A guaranteed recovery protects Sarah, but if you want to take this to the jury, I believe we'll win, probably bigger, but there's always risk. Michael and Jennifer looked at each other, having a silent conversation with their eyes. Finally, Jennifer spoke. We want to see this through. We want the jury to hear Sarah. We want them to understand what happened and why it matters. We didn't come this far to accept a quiet settlement. Nodded, having hoped they would say exactly that. Then that's what we'll do. When settlement negotiations failed, shifted strategy dramatically. He decided to go on offense. He called Officer to testify, hoping to humanize him and create sympathy. Took the stand in his dress uniform, his demeanor calm and professional. He that Duke was exceptionally well trained, that he'd received no credible warnings about the enclosure, and that the incident was completely unpredictable. But cross-examination was devastating. He presented with the 2 written warnings from his supervisor about the loose latch, claimed he didn't remember receiving them, presented the maintenance work order that himself had supposedly reviewed, offered vague explanations about bureaucratic processes. When asked him directly whether he'd ever noticed the latch was loose, hesitated, a moment of hesitation that telegraphed doubt to the jury. Officer, did you not ever notice that the enclosure gate latch was not properly aligned? His jaw tightened. I may have noticed minor misalignment, but I didn't consider it a safety issue. Yet your supervisor specifically told you it posed a safety risk, correct? I don't recall the conversation being characterized that way. Walked back to his table and retrieved a document. This is your supervisor's contemporaneous note from her interview with you. It states, quote, Officer advised regarding faulty gate latch on K9 enclosure. Officer acknowledged understanding but has not submitted work request for repairs. Advised this poses potential safety risk. So your supervisor explicitly told you it posed a safety risk and you did nothing. Is that accurate? His face flushed. I followed standard procedures. Your standard procedures included ignoring explicit warnings about a safety hazard. The objection came swiftly, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Officer presented with irrefutable evidence of his negligence and watched him attempt to minimize or deny it. By Friday of the first week, the police department's case had essentially collapsed. Their final witness was Captain, who attempted to defend the department's protocols and claimed that animal attacks were inherent risks that couldn't be completely eliminated. But even his testimony seemed defensive rather than compelling. As the weekend approached, Judge informed the jury that testimony would conclude Monday and closing arguments would follow Tuesday. Sarah's direct testimony would occur Monday morning. Everyone knew this would be the emotional crescendo of the trial. Over the weekend, Sarah met with Dr. Foster one final time. They practiced her testimony, reviewed her grounding techniques, and Foster reminded her that she could ask for breaks if needed. Sarah was nervous but also oddly ready. She understood that everything she'd experienced, everything she'd endured in therapy and trauma recovery, had been preparation for this moment. On Monday morning, October 23rd, Sarah was sworn in. She sat in the witness stand, appearing even smaller than usual in the large courtroom chair, and David began his questions gently. He took her through the events of that summer afternoon with care, allowing her to describe in her own words what had happened. Sarah spoke with surprising clarity about the fear, the pain, the feeling of being attacked by something massive and unstoppable. Then came the moment that would change everything. Judge asked Sarah if she could approach the witness stand and point out the location of the fence where Duke had broken through. Sarah stood slowly and walked toward the front of the courtroom. As she passed the area where Duke sat in his ceremonial vest, something shifted in her. She stopped. She looked directly at the dog. And in that moment of confrontation with her trauma, Sarah pointed. It was a simple gesture, a child's finger extended toward the source of her pain. But in that point was everything: the violation, the fear, the courage, the truth. The courtroom held its breath. The courtroom didn't just freeze, it seemed to stop breathing. Sarah's extended arm, her small finger pointing directly at Duke, created a visual and emotional epicenter that no legal argument could match. The German shepherd, sensing the intense focus, shifted uncomfortably in his vest, but remained secure and restrained. For several seconds that felt like an eternity, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the faint humming of the courthouse air conditioning system and the barely perceptible sound of Sarah's shallow breathing. Juror number 4, a woman named no relation to David, who worked as a middle school teacher, felt her chest tighten. She had been carefully taking notes throughout the trial, trying to remain objective and judicial in her approach. But there was nothing objective about this moment. She was looking at a child, a real, vulnerable child, identifying her trauma. His eyes filled with tears that she didn't bother to hide. The professional facade fell away, and what remained was a human being witnessing injustice made manifest in the form of a 9-year-old girl's pointed finger. Juror number 7, a retired police officer named Frank, experienced a complex cascade of emotions. His first instinct was defensive, to protect law enforcement, to rationalize, to find ways the police department wasn't completely at fault. But he couldn't. He'd spent 32 years in uniform, and he knew better than anyone that when protocols were ignored and warnings went unheeded, people got hurt. Officer wasn't a villain. He was a colleague who had been negligent. But negligence that resulted in a child's injury was still negligence. Frank felt his earlier sympathies crumbling under the weight of Sarah's silent accusation. Juror number 11, a middle-aged accountant named David, found himself physically unable to look away. His own daughter was 10 years old. He'd brought her to the courthouse once, showed her the building, explained what judges did. She'd asked him, "Is the judge supposed to protect people?" He'd said yes. Now, watching a 9-year-old girl point at her attacker, he understood that his daughter's safety depended on institutions taking responsibility seriously. The point felt like a judgment on all of them: society, the legal system, adult decision-makers who were supposed to protect children. Judge Robert maintained his composure, but his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. He'd presided over hundreds of cases, criminal, civil, family law, but rarely had he witnessed such a purely honest moment of human testimony. No words, no narrative construction, just a child's traumatized body expressing truth through the most primitive and powerful gesture possible. Officer James' face drained of color. He stared at Sarah's pointed finger as though it was literally piercing through his defenses. For the first time during the trial, the carefully constructed professional persona cracked. His eyes glistened, and he looked down at his hands, unable to maintain eye contact with the girl whose life his negligence had altered. Several spectators noted the moment, understanding it as an admission that transcended legal argument. Richard, the defense attorney, felt his case disintegrate in real time. He'd been trained in legal argument, in the presentation of evidence, in rhetorical strategy. But he had no defense against this. No cross-examination could diminish it. No technical argument could overcome it. The point was a verdict in itself, a simple, eloquent rejection of every excuse he'd offered. David felt a profound sense of vindication mixed with something more complex, a recognition that his role as an attorney had suddenly become secondary. This was no longer about legal strategy or courtroom tactics. This was about truth asserting itself, despite all institutional attempts to obscure, minimize, or conceal it. He watched the jury's reactions with the knowledge that whatever closing arguments he offered, whatever technical legal points he raised, paled in comparison to what had just occurred in this courtroom. Jennifer Mitchell pressed her hand against her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She was watching her daughter, her traumatized, brave daughter, communicate in the most devastating and honest way possible. She felt an overwhelming rush of emotions: pride, heartbreak, vindication, and a deep maternal instinct that wanted to rush to Sarah's side and protect her from ever having to experience anything difficult again. But she remained seated, understanding that Sarah was doing something important, something that transcended protection. Michael Mitchell's hand gripped the armrest of his chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. He watched his daughter point at her attacker, and he felt the full weight of the journey they'd traveled together, from that terrifying afternoon in the backyard to this moment of reckoning. The point was everything he'd fought for. It was validation. It was justice beginning to take form. The moment stretched on for perhaps 10 seconds, though it felt infinitely longer. Finally, Judge gently cleared his throat, signaling that testimony should continue. But the trajectory of the trial had shifted irreversibly. Sarah answered a few more questions about the location of the fence, but everyone understood that the critical testimony had already occurred. When David finished his questioning, approached for cross-examination, but it was a pro forma exercise. He asked a few technical questions about Sarah's positioning in the yard, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. The jury was looking at him with something approaching contempt. Here was a lawyer attempting to trip up a 9-year-old girl who had just demonstrated extraordinary courage. The jury's discomfort with the entire exercise was palpable. After Sarah stepped down from the witness stand, Judge called for a 15-minute recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, people moving with hushed conversations and lingering glances toward the jury box. In the hallway, reporters immediately swarmed the team, asking questions about Sarah's emotional moment. Deflected, saying only that Sarah had honestly about her experience. In the courthouse bathroom, the juror found herself alone with one of the court officers. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, seeing her own face as though for the first time. She thought about her own students, about how she would feel if one of them had been attacked, and then had to sit in a courtroom while powerful institutions tried to minimize the harm done to them. The point had changed something fundamental in her. She would vote for accountability. She knew it with absolute certainty. During the recess, the police department's legal team held an emergency meeting in their temporary office in the courthouse building. Captain, who was present for the proceedings, looked devastated. The strategy had failed catastrophically, turned to him with grim resignation. "We need to seriously consider settlement now. That point just cost us potentially millions in additional damages. If the jury convicts us on punitive damages, we could be looking at a substantially larger verdict." But it was too late for settlement. Judge reconvened the trial, and the remaining testimony moved forward mechanically. Nobody was really paying attention anymore. Everyone was thinking about Sarah's point. The moment had already rendered the verdict. That evening, as news outlets broadcast footage of Sarah's moment repeatedly, it became something larger than the trial itself. A child had pointed at injustice and been heard. It was simple. It was powerful. It was the kind of moment that transcended legal technicality and spoke directly to human conscience. Late that night, Sarah sat with her mother on the edge of her bed, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. "Mom, did I do okay?" she asked quietly. Jennifer pulled her daughter close. "You were perfect, sweetheart. You were brave and honest, and everyone could see that. You did exactly what needed to be done." Sarah nodded, feeling something shift inside her. The point had been cathartic. She confronted her trauma directly and hadn't been destroyed by it. She'd survived the moment she'd feared most. And in surviving it, she'd found something that resembled healing. Closing arguments took place on Tuesday morning, but everyone understood they were merely formality. David delivered his closing with the knowledge that his case had essentially been won the moment Sarah pointed at Duke. He walked the jury through the evidence methodically. The latch, the ignored maintenance requests, the behavioral assessment warnings, officers' documented negligence. But what did most effectively was remind the jury of what they'd witnessed. "You saw a 9-year-old girl point at the source of her trauma," told the jury, his voice carrying the weight of that moment. That point was a simple statement of truth. It was a child saying, "This is what hurt me. This is what should have been prevented." Every piece of evidence we've presented supports her point. The negligence, the warnings, the failures, they all lead to the same conclusion. The Columbus Police Department knew or should have known that Duke was dangerous and failed to prevent this tragedy. Justice requires that they be held accountable. His closing was defensive and diminished. He attempted to argue that mechanical failures happen, that institutions shouldn't be held liable for the unpredictable actions of animals, and that officer had acted reasonably given the circumstances. But the jury wasn't receptive. They'd seen the evidence. They'd heard Sarah testify, and they'd witnessed officers' credibility collapse under cross-examination. His words landed like stones in water, sinking immediately without creating meaningful ripples. Judge provided his jury instructions, carefully explaining the legal standards for negligence, the concept of institutional liability, and the types of damages they were authorized to award. The jury retired to deliberate at 11:47 a.m. on Tuesday, October 25th. The waiting was excruciating. David advised the Mitchell family to leave the courthouse and return to his office rather than sitting in the hallway like anxious spectators. But none of them could concentrate on anything else. Jennifer sat in his conference room, staring out the window at downtown Columbus without really seeing it. Michael paced back and forth, checking his phone repeatedly as though it might ring with a verdict update, despite the fact that the jury had been deliberating for less than an hour. Sarah sat between her parents, coloring in a book that Dr. Foster had given her, her pencil strokes precise and focused, a manifestation of her attempt to control something while everything else felt beyond her influence. By late afternoon, the jury sent a note to Judge asking for clarification on the definition of punitive damages. This was a positive sign for the plaintiff's side. It suggested the jury was considering whether to award punitive damages beyond compensatory damages, which would indicate they believed the police department's conduct warranted punishment rather than merely compensation. Explained this to the family with guarded optimism. They're thinking about holding the department accountable not just for the harm caused to Sarah, but for the negligence itself, explained. That's a stronger verdict than merely covering her medical expenses. Day 2 of deliberation began Wednesday morning. By noon, the jury sent another note indicating they wanted to review certain testimony and documentary evidence. Judge arranged for specific portions to be replayed and documents to be reread. The jury continued deliberating through the afternoon. By 5:30 p.m., Judge sent word that the jury could continue until 6:30 p.m., but if they didn't reach a verdict by then, they would be sequestered overnight rather than adjourning. At 6:18 p.m., the bailiff received word. The jury had reached a verdict. The courthouse filled quickly as word spread that a verdict had been reached. Reporters assembled in the hallway outside the courtroom. The media had been following the case intensely since Sarah's iconic moment had gone viral on social media and been featured on national news programs. By day 2 of deliberations, the case had transcended local coverage and was being discussed on morning shows across the country. The image of Sarah pointing at Duke had become the face of institutional accountability and child protection. At 6:52 p.m., everyone was seated. The jury was brought in, and they looked somber, the expression of people who had spent 3 days wrestling with the weight of their decision. The jury foreperson, a woman named Williams who worked as a social services administrator, stood as the judge requested the verdict form. Judge read each question carefully. On the question of whether the Columbus Police Department was negligent in maintaining the K-9 enclosure, how do you find? We find them negligent, Williams said, her voice steady. On the question of whether this negligence was a substantial factor in causing harm to Sarah Mitchell, how do you find? We find it was a substantial factor. Question after question, the verdict came back decisively against the police department. 100% liability. The jury found no comparative negligence that could be attributed to Sarah or her parents. Then came the damages portion. For compensatory damages, the actual medical expenses, pain and suffering, and emotional trauma, what amount do you find appropriate? $850,000, Williams read from the form. A significant amount, but then came the critical question. On the question of punitive damages, damages intended to punish the defendant for their negligent conduct and to deter similar conduct in the future. Do you believe such damages are warranted? Yes, Williams responded. In what amount? There was a pause as Williams looked at the form, seeming to measure the weight of the number she was about to read. $350,000 in punitive damages. The courtroom erupted. Sarah's family embraced, tears streaming down faces. Supporters stood and applauded. The total award was $1.2 million, a verdict that sent a clear message about the cost of institutional negligence. The jury had spoken with unmistakable clarity. This wasn't an accident. This was a failure that deserved punishment and deterrence. Officer's face went completely white. Captain looked like he'd been physically struck. The defense team immediately began making notes about appeal grounds, but everyone understood that this verdict would be difficult to overturn on appeal. The evidence had been overwhelming, and the jury's decision was well-reasoned and proportionate. Judge thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. Several jurors, as they filed out, made eye contact with Sarah and offered small nods of acknowledgement. The juror who had cried during Sarah's testimony actually smiled at her, a gesture of solidarity and support. That evening, as news outlets reported the verdict, Sarah found herself the center of national attention. Images of her pointing at Duke, paired with headlines about the $1.2 million verdict, appeared on television screens across America. Her story became shorthand for a larger conversation about institutional accountability and child protection. The point, that simple gesture, had become an icon of courage and truth prevailing against institutional power. Late that night, Sarah sat with her parents and David in his office as they celebrated the verdict. Was already discussing the larger implications. The publicity around the case would likely force the police department to implement significant changes. He was already in contact with representatives from the city council about implementing new K-9 safety protocols. This verdict, told the family, is going to ripple far beyond this courtroom. You've done something important here. Sarah, you've changed things. Sarah, now visibly exhausted but also visibly transformed, looked at her attorney. Will other kids be safer now? Nodded. Yes. Because of you, other kids will be safer. That's a remarkable legacy for someone who's only 9 years old. Michael pulled his daughter close and Jennifer held them both. They had endured an impossible journey from that terrifying afternoon in the backyard to this moment of vindication and justice. It wasn't perfect. No verdict could erase what had happened to Sarah or eliminate her trauma. But it was accountability. It was recognition. It was the world saying, what happened to you matters, and we're going to make sure it never happens to another child. The real work of healing and change was just beginning. 2 years after the trial verdict, Sarah Mitchell stood on a gymnasium stage in downtown Columbus, microphone in hand, looking out at a crowd of 500 people assembled for the dedication ceremony of the newly implemented K-9 safety initiative. She was 11 years old now, no longer the traumatized 9-year-old who had pointed at her attacker in a courtroom. The physical scars on her leg and arm had faded to faint white lines that were barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. The psychological scars had also begun their own process of healing, though the journey had been long and required years of therapy with Dr. Helen, the trauma specialist. Sarah wore a simple blue dress, the same shade as the one she'd worn to testify, and her parents stood in the front row of the audience, beaming with pride and something else that could only be described as profound respect. Michael and Jennifer had watched their daughter undergo an extraordinary transformation. From the girl who refused to leave the house, who flinched at loud noises, who couldn't speak about the attack without breaking into tears, Sarah had emerged as something unexpected, a young advocate for safety and accountability. The gymnasium belonged to Lincoln Middle School, and the crowd included city council members, police department officials, animal safety experts, other families who had experienced similar incidents, journalists and ordinary citizens who had been moved by Sarah's story. The Columbus police chief, Robert Williams, stood near the stage. The previous administration had attempted to minimize and defend, but Williams had arrived 6 months ago with a mandate to reform the K-9 program and implement meaningful systemic changes. He had embraced the opportunity to use Sarah's case as a catalyst for transformation, rather than viewing it as an institutional attack. As Sarah approached the microphone, she took a moment to collect herself. Dr. Foster had worked with her extensively on public speaking, helping her manage the anxiety that came with being in the spotlight. Sarah had grown comfortable with her story, but speaking publicly about trauma never became easy. It required a kind of vulnerability that didn't get easier with practice, only more purposeful. "Hi everyone," Sarah began, her voice steady and surprisingly mature for an 11-year-old. "My name is Sarah Mitchell, and you probably know me because of what happened to me when I was 7 years old. A police dog attacked me in my backyard. For a long time after that, I was really scared. I was scared to go outside. I was scared of loud noises. I was scared of dogs. I had nightmares almost every night." She paused, letting the words settle into the room. The audience was completely silent, all attention focused on this young girl who had become the face of institutional accountability. "But something interesting happened," Sarah continued. "My parents and my lawyer and a lot of other people started asking questions about how the attack happened, and they found out that there were people who knew the dog could be dangerous, but they didn't do anything about it. They had chances to fix things, but they didn't. And that made me understand something important. Sometimes when bad things happen, it's not just an accident. Sometimes it's because people made choices, bad choices, and didn't take responsibility." Sarah looked directly at Police Chief Williams. Today, Chief Williams is announcing new rules for how police dogs are taken care of. There are going to be regular inspections of the places where dogs live. There's going to be better training for the officers who take care of the dogs. And if a dog shows signs of being dangerous, there are going to be better ways to handle that. These rules exist because of what happened to me." She turned back to the full audience. "But I want to say something important. I'm not just a girl who got attacked. I'm a girl who survived. And I'm a girl who, with the help of my family and my doctor and my lawyer, decided that I wasn't going to let what happened to me stay hidden or forgotten. I decided that I was going to tell my story, even though it was scary, because I knew that if I didn't, other kids might get hurt the same way I did." Sarah's voice grew stronger. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. Being brave means you do important things even when you are scared. I was terrified in that courtroom. I was terrified when I had to see the dog again. I was terrified when people were watching me and listening to me, but I did it anyway because I knew it mattered, and it did matter. Because of that, kids in Columbus are going to be safer, and that's what I want other kids who've been hurt to know. Your story matters. Speaking the truth, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, can change things." She concluded with words that had been carefully considered. "I'm still healing. I still have bad days where I think about what happened, but I'm not just a victim anymore. I'm a survivor, and I'm someone who helped make things better. That's a really powerful thing to be able to say about yourself." The gymnasium erupted in applause. Adults stood, children stood, journalists took photographs. Several people in the audience were crying openly. The juror who had cried during Sarah's testimony was in the audience. She had maintained contact with the Mitchell family and had become a kind of mentor figure to Sarah. She stood with tears streaming down her face, clapping vigorously. After the formal program concluded, there was a reception where community members approached the Mitchell family to offer congratulations and support. Police Chief Williams spent considerable time speaking with Michael and Jennifer, expressing genuine appreciation for their willingness to push the department toward reform rather than simply accepting a settlement and disappearing from public view. "Your daughter's courage," Williams told them, "has forced us to confront some difficult truths about our operations. That's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Thank you for that." In the following weeks, the Mitchell family formalized something they'd been discussing: the creation of the Sarah Mitchell Foundation for Animal Safety and Institutional Accountability. The $1.2 million verdict had been placed in trust for Sarah's future, but Michael and Jennifer wanted to use the publicity and momentum generated by the case to create lasting change beyond Columbus. The foundation would work with municipalities across the country to implement animal safety protocols, conduct facility inspections, and provide support services for children who had experienced animal trauma. Sarah became the foundation's public face, not because her parents wanted to exploit her experience, but because she had explicitly asked to be involved. For a girl who had been traumatized into silence, finding her voice and using it to help others became part of her healing journey. She began speaking at schools, at conferences, at city council meetings. Not always comfortably, not without anxiety, but with a sense of purpose that transcended her trauma. By age 13, Sarah had appeared on national news programs discussing animal safety. She'd consulted with legislators drafting new animal protection laws. She'd visited other cities and met with families who had experienced similar incidents. In each interaction, she brought the same message: institutional accountability matters, speaking truth matters, and survivors can become agents of change. Her relationship with dogs had also evolved. Through careful, trauma-informed exposure therapy with Dr. Sarah had gradually reintroduced herself to dogs, not the police canine that had attacked her, but other, gentler animals. She would never be comfortable around aggressive dogs, but she'd learned to distinguish between danger and safety, between legitimate fear and anxiety rooted in trauma. On the night of her 13th birthday, Sarah sat in her room and looked at a framed photograph her mother had taken. Sarah pointing at Duke in the courtroom. What had once been a moment of raw trauma had become a symbol of courage and accountability. It had been featured in textbooks, in legal education materials, in discussions of institutional reform. That single gesture had rippled through society in ways she was still discovering. She thought about the 7-year-old girl who had loved butterflies and summer afternoons. That girl was gone. In her place was a 13-year-old who had survived, spoken truth, and changed things. The attack had stolen something from her, her innocence, her sense of safety, her childhood freedom. But it had also given her something unexpected: purpose, strength, and the knowledge that her voice mattered. Michael knocked on her door and found his daughter staring at the photograph. He sat beside her on the bed. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently. "I'm thinking about how different my life would be if that fence had been fixed," Sarah said. "But I'm also thinking about how much worse things could be for other kids if we had just accepted what happened and moved on. I'm glad we fought." Michael squeezed his daughter's shoulder. The journey from that terrifying afternoon in the backyard to this moment represented not just personal recovery, but institutional transformation. It was a reminder that institutions don't change through passive acceptance. They change through courageous individuals willing to point at injustice and refuse to look away. The point had become a movement, and the movement had become a legacy.